Really sorry to have dropped off there. I hope you're still watching us. Over to David and to Arun Mohan Sukumar.
Thanks, Sanjay. I think it's quite fitting that we have this. The JLF folks tell us that this is the first time that's happened to them in many discussions, but it's fitting that it's happening during a discussion on technology. Perfectly
Absolutely. Yeah.
exemplifying the ghost in the machine. But we were talking about the well, for a lack of a better word, the zeitgeist into which Silicon Valley was born into, and then sort of has evolved over the years. There's a constant degree of debate and uh, churn that happens in terms of what is the mood in Silicon Valley. I think that's quite interesting to an outside observer, because one of the things that I found while working on my book is that in India, the development of technology has been state-centric in that it was always tied to the notion of national development. And
Sure.
because it was tied to the idea of national development, you had crucial interventions by the political class, by the technocratic class, who all sort of foisted their version of what technology should mean for the public. Whereas if you look at, and of course that has had its good and bad effects on how India perceives technology today as a country and as a society. But if you look at Silicon Valley, it was sort of midwifed by the counterculture movement and the kind of the controversies and the massive churn in what was right and what was wrong in terms of people's thinking, and that was central to the birth and evolution of Silicon Valley. And you were of course talking about employee activism today, walkouts from Google, protests by the resignation of a senior vice president at Amazon. So you're seeing this churn all the time, and I was wondering whether you could sort of uh, you know, do some crystal gazing and see how that is going to affect Silicon Valley's trajectory in the future, even after the pandemic. Because you're seeing the situation where many Silicon Valley products are absolutely essential to our lives, including this conversation. We're doing this by Zoom, and we can't live today without. Many of us can't live today without Amazon services, and these kind of applications are only likely to increase their prominence and relevance in our life. But what is it that you see by way of a backlash beyond what you see in terms of big tech or antitrust? How is the popular mood going to coalesce around Silicon Valley's products?
Oh, that's a very hard thing. Historians always like to say, "Well, who knows?" I'm just looking at the past. I would just kind of, I'll try and give you some sort of
Yeah.
response. But I do think that, your characterization of the contrasting the story of the development of Silicon Valley from, let's say, the development of technology in India.
Right.
Well, there are a lot of differences. I mean, national projects and the importance of the state and actions by the state have been crucial to the development of Silicon Valley, especially in its earliest phases.
Right.
So the kind of active participation of firms in what became known as Silicon Valley, it wasn't known that way, but until the early 70s, the a lot of these firms were participating in the Cold War project of the United States, and in particular, the competition, military competition against the Soviets, that in many ways was took place through the medium of the development of electronics technologies and what they enabled in other realms, like strategic weapons. So while the form of it was different, in Silicon Valley and in California, I've sometimes called it a contract garrison state. So it was not by, let's say, direct participation or decision making by
Right.
elements of the state, in the organizations producing or deploying technologies, through vital contracts and grants, funding of research, buying products at, you know, being a price insensitive customer for buying products, um, giving other sorts of kind of financial support and schemes to encourage venture investing, even giving direct support to companies to expand their manufacturing capabilities in different ways. Like these were all actions of the state. And also, importantly, and as Margaret O'Mara points out very well, I think makes a very good argument in her book, The Code, um, some of the national immigration policy decisions made by the state really contributed a lot, you know, essentially decisions that allowed for the freer movement of people, really, you know, had a big deal for, was very important to the development of Silicon Valley. So there's all that said. And I think that, I mean, prognosticating about, you know, where do we go from the tech lash? I think that in a macro sense, I think what we can expect is an evolution of the nature and position of some of these very large technology firms to adapt to and contend with their changed position on the world stage. So when some people, like some of the people involved with creating Twitter or with Facebook, say they never imagined that these projects that experienced hypergrowth would be, you know, central to political communication and activity worldwide, I believe them. It would probably be a very hard thing to imagine. I certainly could not have imagined that. I don't think I could have ever imagined that. So I think what we're seeing is a kind of evolution in the kind of nature and stances of these firms. And one firm that I actually see this happening in a lot is Microsoft, with some of their, you know, some of the positions of some of the key executives and activities by the firm itself being much more pro-regulation, much more wanting to be active in kind of shaping conversation or participating, calling for governance of it and wanting to participate in that. So that's a shift. And I think that of necessity that we may expect that kind of evolution to change, that evolution to take place in general as these companies contend with the realities of the use of their services and their deliberate global growth. So, but I do think that the pandemic, for me, interestingly, throws, well, I think it will be very fascinating to see how the dynamics, the experience of the pandemic plays out in the dynamics of the tech lash, which we were talking about before, this kind of thoroughgoing critique of Silicon Valley that people in Silicon Valley today perceive is going on about them culturally, economically, politically. And, you know, so as you were saying, on the one side, there are these services, platforms, and products of digital technology that are making possible remote work, making possible discussions like the one that we're lucky enough to be having today. And there also, these digital technologies seem to be implicated in many aspects of successful responses to the pandemic, including public health activities and medical research. So that's one side. On the other side, these very same services, platforms, and products are like a primary medium for what I think could be fairly described as a reality war that's taking place. You know, in the United States and elsewhere, There
Right.
is a plague of misinformation and deception and propaganda having to do with the pandemic itself, um, as well as many other topics, including politics.
Right.
And I think that this reality war is certainly at least partly to blame for the continuing failure of the United States to respond to the pandemic and harmful responses in other countries like the UK. And so I think it's an open question as to whether or not the pandemic is going to, amplify or dampen the tech lash. I really don't have a sense of which.
Yeah. And I think it's a important and a sort of a perceptible shift, right? Because, for example, you mentioned Microsoft. Microsoft was at the forefront of fighting the government in the 80s and the 90s on so many things, including the so-called browser wars, and on many issues regarding antitrust. And today they are at the forefront of, as you said, many activities in governance, not only within the United States, but also internationally. So, for example, they are a key participant, and in fact, you would say they are an entrepreneur in many conversations on cyber norms that would lay the foundation for the basis of peaceful uses of cyberspace. They are also one of the key, I would say, key collaborators, key founders of what is called the Cyber Peace Institute in Geneva.
Hmm.
They have been engaging the UN on a number of issues. So I think it's certainly a dramatic shift, and it would be interesting to see if other companies follow the trajectory of Microsoft. In some respects, Microsoft has a head start over the other guys, given that it has simply been around for longer than, say, a Facebook or a Google. But I wonder if this is the final transformation of the classic Silicon Valley company. You start out either being deeply skeptical or suspicious of government involvement, even though, as you rightly pointed out, the history of Silicon Valley is steeped in government involvement, especially the Defense Department, U.S.
Sure.
Defense Department's assistance. But then, you lead to a situation where Google employees walk out or register their protest for, in opposition to Google's decision supplying technologies to the U.S. Defense Department. And maybe the final transformation of that is a more constructive engagement with the government. And I think it's fascinating because you don't see these kinds of debates in other parts, whether it's in India or in other Silicon Valley-like ecosystems, like Shenzhen in China.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think the evolution is fascinating. But do you feel that, for till now, for example, we've been talking about the big tech companies, the guys who sort of are the Silicon Valley poster child, the
Yeah.
poster children of Silicon Valley. But do you also see the sense happening with startups? Because a lot of these startups often, they pride themselves in being the underdogs, in being in being anti-establishment. You can see this debate on the media today. In many Silicon Valley entrepreneurs are registering their opposition towards what they call establishment media, whether it's the New York Times or even in the so-called liberal media outlets. Do you see this shift of have needing to work constructively with the government, even with the upstarts, the young entrepreneurs of Silicon Valley?
I probably don't have a very good vantage point to to answer that question well. I do think that I can think of examples of startups that are being created or have been created recently that
Right.
are aimed toward having the government as a customer. But that's not the same thing as being kind of having a different stance toward regulation and governance, or having not this kind of abandoning a kind of libertarian political viewpoint. That I'm not sure. I mean, it certainly had some sway in certain areas of Silicon Valley and in certain
Mhm.
companies. I don't know actually how pervasive it is, I think it's probably exaggerated, but I don't know that for sure. Um, but again, I think there's like a diversity. You know, there's a diversity of startups and what they're about and what their attitude are. You know, there are some very interesting. There's a very interesting kind of startup sector and community that is very explicit about serving different kinds of populations, and actually, you know, explicitly about kind of improving lives for Black Americans, and other groups that are challenged in contemporary society. So there are, and there are others that seem to be just a pure, you know, like hyper growth, you know, Uber for X,
Yeah.
you know, coming out of an incubator sort of
Yeah.
classic thing. So it's pretty diverse. I really don't, am not in touch with that, the contemporary scene as much of the scene in the past,
Yeah.
to be able to answer to that.
Sure.
But it does
Yeah.
seem like, you know, amongst the large firms, you know, these are firms who are maturing into large established incumbent firms.
Right.
And so perhaps this is the same thing that happened for a company like General Electric, or would happen for a large food producer. You know,
Yeah.
I'm not sure how, you know, I guard against always attributing it's going to be unique because it's a technology company. You know,
Right.
it could just be something also that happens to companies when they become a large multinational incumbent,
Yeah.
that
And
their
I think
stance
there's something
towards
about,
regulation and
yeah.
governance changes.
Yeah, I think there's also a point that many historians are making now, what you said about the development of traditional industry, especially after the Second World War in the United States. There are many analogies and lessons to be learned for Silicon Valley to
Yes.
understand how the maturation or the transformation of Silicon Valley is happening. But we do have a couple of audience questions already, and I do
Oh,
want to talk
great.
to you a little bit more about the immigration aspect of it. But
Yes.
let's take a few questions. We have a question from Sachdev Ramakrishna, who asks, aren't museums like the one that you've created so vital to inculcate scientific temper among the millennials, like the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum, which still evokes a sense of awe around the NASA moon mission? Do you see that as a sort of a, for lack of a better word, a social compulsion or a social motivation behind, a societal motivation behind the Computer History Museum?
Yes, I do think so. I mean, I think it's, again, with this phrase that we have come up with and like very much, this idea of decoding technology for everyone. I think what
Yeah.
we're trying to do is both unpack this story of digital technologies and the history of computing as the story of people, actions that people took, choices that people made, choices that people made about what to do with these technologies or not do
Right.
with these technologies, and also the story of people's imagination that came to play. So in that, this, that is to decode, is to demystify, but hopefully also to engage. So engage people who, with the with this kind of story and impact about computing and digital technologies, both for people who just want to realize that we need to understand what these things are and how these things work to really
Right.
be citizens of the world citizens today. We need to understand this to know how to act in the world. But also, I think importantly, and this is represented by a lot of the educational programming and a lot of the interpretive and exhibit work we do, we also want to, while not giving a kind of a biased or overly positive telling of history, we also do think that it's important to show and provide a sense of wonder for some of these technologies, and hopefully uh, museum experience, and hopefully give a museum experience that really makes a young visitor or a not so young millennial visitor, see this stuff and say, I want to be a part of this. I want to
Right.
add my story to this story. So
Yeah.
um,
I
that's
think,
how I would answer that.
as a footnote to that, one of the challenges that the Computer History Museum faces, unlike the Smithsonian, is that you neither have the perspective that distance offers, because you're not seeing a rocket or a space shuttle from a far distance. It's the technologies that you catalog as being historical is stuff that you engage with on a daily basis, and stuff that you are viscerally engaged with, especially from the work from home life. But there's also another question on the work that
Yeah.
you do, just from
Yes.
Nilanjana. As part of the Computer History Museum, how much of a role does oral history being digitized play, and what is the process that you follow? And I know you've been working also in India on this front.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful question because it's near to dear to my heart. Oral history is one of the things that I really pursue um, in my own career and have pursued. I've done, I don't know, a couple hundred oral histories throughout my career, these kind of in-depth life history interviews. And that was very much a part of what brought me to join up with the Computer History Museum, is their amazing oral history program and collection. Over 1,000 of these, and many of them video recorded. All of the transcripts for the oral histories that we have done are available as free to download PDFs on our website, and many of our videotaped oral histories are available, again, free and open on our YouTube channel. Um, and and we have found that oral history is an amazingly important element of our collection and way to preserve the history of computing. We can capture the stories of people who are invisible in the kind of documentary records. For example, I recently conducted an oral history interview with a woman named Patricia Anderson, who was involved with, as a production worker, for growing the silicon crystals from which,
Oh, wow.
silicon wafers are made, and then integrated circuits are made out of them. This was like, somebody who was pretty modest, hourly wage sort of person, but um, you know, by luck, we found her and were able to record her story as an oral history. And we're also able to record, the stories from founders and CEOs to users and critics. So there's a wide variety of things that we can collect with oral history, but also it is just they are the essence of this kind of position that
Absolutely.
the history of computing is the story of people and what they did. So it really
Right.
brings the people to the fore. Where we
Yeah.
can lose that, especially somehow when we're talking about technology, more so than when we're talking about something else like art or banking or something, somehow with technology that people drop out.
Yeah, I think it's something that we are seriously beginning to sort of think about in India as well, because you now have at least a couple of generation of entrepreneurs, many of whom are old, and therefore, they are, some of them are, in terms of their health, they are no longer able to sit for extended interviews. So this is a discussion that has required some urgency in India as well. Well, we have around sort of 5 minutes or so to the end of the
Thank
session,
you.
and I want to sort of touch on a subject that matters a great deal to Silicon Valley, and that's immigration. And
Yes.
um, it's something that matters also a great deal to India, because the Indian success story, among other things, is widely attributed to the fact that the positive connotations, of course, of Indian entrepreneurs or Indian engineers having moved to the United States, especially Silicon Valley, to make their fortunes, also seen negatively in India as a brain phenomenon. But you now are seeing this reluctance from the US government, at least the Trump administration, to welcome more immigrants. We don't know whether this policy is transitory, whether it'll be followed up by future administrations. But do you think what is likely to be a lasting effect of these policies, or at least the signals that are coming from the government on Silicon Valley?
I think that if it continues, it'll be extremely harmful. Um, I don't know how to say it more starkly than that. I think that if you look at history, you can see that much of the development of the digital world to date, both in sort of the US dominated sphere, the China dominated sphere, and also in India, has been predicated on this regime of sort of like international neoliberalism and globalization, which is, a huge part of which is about um, freeing the flow of people. And, you can even view the story of the rise of digital technology, which, the kind of modern electronic computing story is like basically one human lifetime, into the past. That's how, so it's kind of coextensive and intertwined with the history of globalization. So, in my opinion, the greater movement of people into the US has been very important to the growth and vibrancy of Silicon Valley and other tech ecosystems, and in general. But, my opinion is that this is also what's vital for Silicon Valley is also vital for other digital technology centers and ecosystems. Free flows of people to and from Silicon Valley and other regions of the US are vital for those regions, but also for all the other regions around the world, Europe, South Asia, East Asia, South and Central America, Africa, everywhere. And I think that, rising nationalism in the US and China and India are all kind of threats to that movement. And so I think, are threats to the continuing vibrant and fast development of these digital technologies.
Yeah, I think that it's likely to have feedback effects. For example, some of the people who are most closely involved in the building of public digital infrastructure in India, many of them are Silicon Valley returnees. So and they bring with them certain attitudes towards what it means to be working with technology, but also what values those technologies should embed. And it'd be fascinating to see whether all of those things change once these borders sort of come up. But I've been told that our time is up, but I just wanted to
Oh.
take a moment to thank you for your time and to tell us, about all the work that the Computer History Museum is doing, and how you see yourself situated in the context of what's happening in Silicon Valley today. Because this is not something that, of course, Indians are aware of Silicon Valley and what's going on in the world of technology broadly defined, but the work of institutions like Computer History Museums, the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, and other institutions, comparable institutions across the world, is not something that we often think about. So I want to thank you for giving that perspective to us.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. Thanks to everybody taking time out of their busy schedules to watch. And just Google Computer History Museum to see what we have there for you. I hope it's a lot. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Arun Mohan Sukumar. Thank you, David Brock. Just to, before we end, to get both your reactions, you touched upon it very briefly when you talked about nationalism, growing nationalism, or the rise of nationalism. But just digital technology or new emerging digital technology, authoritarian regimes, and surveillance. So if both of you want to just react to those two issues very quickly as to how do you
David,
see the
take a stab.
correlation, if at all?
I think it's a real concern, when you have a company like Microsoft coming out and saying like we should, I think they recently even maybe suggested banning the use of facial recognition. They're so acutely concerned about this, and in the wake of the unrest about police violence and systemic racism in the US, a lot of firms have said that they weren't going to supply these sorts of facial recognition and other surveillance technologies to police. So I think that's a marker of it. I know there's a tremendous concern about China sort of exporting the surveillance stack of technologies it's developed for its use against the Uyghur population. This kind of turnkey electronic totalitarianism idea. I think a lot of people are concerned about that. And I do wonder, though, ultimately how compatible, well, it's an open question how compatible continued vibrant development of computing and digital technologies would be under such a situation. The Soviet Union is not a great example.
Yeah, and it's sort of geared into the national imagination of developing countries who where, as I said during our discussion, technology has always been, sort of contextualized in along with national development, and it's often been the political class and the governing class that has taken a lead in discussions around innovation. So it's natural that these conversations will animate, and they have been animating policy debates and popular debates in India as well. I think the context may differ slightly in a country like India, which is also looking, for example, the debate on facial recognition. The same views and debates are also happening in India. You see them transposed in the Indian context as well. There's a legitimate question to be asked whether countries can effectively wield this technology for good, or are they such a hopeless cause that there is no alternative but to ban new technologies like facial recognition? Because a lot of debates in India and other developing countries on technology has been predicated on this idea that we have not been able to provide governance and services, public welfare services, to our citizens in a timely or in an effective way. And therefore, it may be possible to use technology to leapfrog into a new generation of governance services that can, avoid the problems of bureaucracy, avoid corruption, the problems that are associated with distance in governing a big country like India. So those discussions are a little tricky, and it's natural that at least, one bureaucrat or technocrat in the Indian establishment would be thinking that we can use this technology for good. So it's going to be difficult, even more difficult than in Silicon Valley in the United States, to extract ourselves from this debate and see the light, as it were. But I suppose the context in which technologies have grown and evolved is really the most important determinant of the outcomes of this debate.
Thank you so much. And as you rightly said, unfortunately, people or governments, authoritarian governments across the world, is perhaps using this as an excuse to also use technology in a particular way for surveillance, pretty much in the same way that they've used the advent of COVID-19 to suppress dissent pretty much across the world, everywhere from Hong Kong to the other end. But thank you all for watching, and thank you, David C. Brock, and thank you, Arun Mohan Sukumar. And please do remember to log in on Wednesday, the 12th of August, for another set of great sessions. And hopefully, because it won't be technology, we won't have a glitch, and you'll be able to watch the entire session as it is. We have a repeat of The Sun and the Flowers, Rupi Kaur in conversation with Supriya Dravid, and that's at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 2:30 p.m. British Summer Time, and 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And the second session on Wednesday, the 12th of August, will be Writing Family. Avni Doshi and Diksha Basu in conversation. Two iconic women writers speak of their different takes on family life, one full of wit and humor, the other dark and overshadowed by pain and misunderstanding. In this conversation, the 2020 Man Booker longlisted author Avni Doshi and actor and writer Diksha Basu discuss the nuances of love, friendship, betrayal, alienation, and class conflict. This will be at 8:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 4 p.m. British Summer Time, and 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Stay safe, enjoy the weekend. See you on Wednesday.